Hi boys and girls! Today we're going to do the sink or float science experiment. So the first thing you need to do before we get started on this experiment is you need to find your content packet and find the paper that says sink or float. And this is going to be a science experiment we're completing today. Just like all of the rest of the science experiments we've completed this year, you don't need to do this science experiment at home. You can just watch this video and follow along with me, but if you want to complete the science experiment at home, all you need is a bucket full of water and these different objects. And then what we're going to do with these objects is we are going to test and see if they sink in the bucket of water or if they float in the bucket of water. I had all of these things at home already, I had a bucket of water, so I didn't have to go out and get anything, so that's always nice. Alright, so pause this video and take out your content packet and open up to the page that says sink or float. Okay, so what we're going to do now, guys, is we're going to start by reading the directions and looking through the paper to make sure we understand it. So the title says sink or float. Directions. Predict whether each object will float when you put it into water by checking the box. After testing each object, record the results. On the back, draw 2 additional things that will float and 2 that will sink. Okay, so the first step is we need to predict. We need to make our prediction if all of these different objects will sink or float. So a prediction is when we make a really good guess if things will sink or float. So what I want you to do now is I want you to put a check mark for each one of these objects. So we're gonna do the first one together, and then I want you to finish the rest of them on your own. So let's do Penny together. We're gonna look at the object. The object is Penny, and then we're gonna make our prediction. Do you think the penny is going to sink in the bucket full of water? Or is it going to float in the bucket full of water? And then once we actually do the science experiment and test if the penny sinks or floats, we're going to put a check mark next to the results column in sink if the penny sinks to the bottom, or float if the penny floats to the bottom. So I think the penny is going to sink. So I'm going to put a check mark in the box that says prediction sink. And what you guys are going to do now is you're going to look at the rest of these objects on your paper and you're going to predict, you're going to make a good guess if the object is going to sink or float. Sink or float. And you're going to do that with the rest of them. So I'm going to read through the different objects we have here. Penny, paperclip, pencil, ping pong ball, rock, spoon, and feather. So go ahead and pause this video and make a prediction if you think paperclip will float. If you think the paperclip will float, you're going to put a check mark on this box. If you think the paperclip will sink, you're going to put a check mark on this box. Alright, I'll see you back here once you have made your predictions for all of these different objects and put your check marks in the prediction column. Alright, boys and girls, we're going to get started on this science experiment. So what I did is I collected my materials, and the different things you're going to need are a bucket full of water. I filled my bucket up halfway with water. I don't want to fill it up too high because I don't want it to spill, and I want to be able to see if my objects sink or float. And then I also had to collect my different objects. So I looked at my paper here, all of the different objects on my paper, and I went around my house and I collected them. I had to go outside to get a rock, and luckily I was able to find a feather That was the hardest thing for me to find, the feather. But I was able to find it. I have a pillow in my house that has some feathers in it, so that's where I got the feather. And also, if you read the directions say to find 2 more objects and to test if they sink or float. So I found 2 more objects that I wanted to test out to see if they were going to sink or float. And those 2 objects can be anything you want. If you're doing this science experiment at home, you can choose any 2 objects. You just want to make sure the 2 objects you choose that are not on the list are things that are okay if they get wet. Alright, so I've collected all my objects and I put them in this container here. And we're going to start at the top of the list and we're going to test out if the object sinks or floats. And it's your job, as you're watching this video on your paper, if the object sinks, here it is, you can see it better. If the object, we're going to start at penny and we're going to go down to the different objects on the list. So for the penny, if the penny sinks, for the result, we're going to put a check mark here. If the penny floats as our result, as part of our science experiment, then we are going to put a check mark there. And we're going to make sure we follow along with that as we go on. Alright, let's make sure this is as close as we can get it. There we go. You can really see the water here. And I used a clear container so you could see through the water better. But you don't have to use a clear container, because if you're doing this at home, you're going to be looking at it above it and you won't see it on video. So I just used a clear container to help us with the video. So I'm going to find my penny. Here's my penny. And now I'm going to put it in the water and test if it sinks or floats. There's the penny all the way down to the bottom. And the penny sinks. So on your paper, you're going to put a check mark in the box that says result sink, because the penny sinks. Alright. Let's move to the next object. The next object is paperclip. So I'm going to find a paperclip in my bucket here. And I'm going to test out if it sinks or floats. Alright. Make sure the water's nice and still. Here's my paperclip. Let's drop it in. The paperclip sinks. So on your paper, you're going to put a check mark on paperclip and sinks. So there it is there. Paperclip sinks. There it is at the bottom of the water, all the way down there. The paperclip sinks. Alright, next up is a pencil. Here's my pencil. And we're going to test if the pencil sinks or floats. Before I put it in the water, do you have a prediction? What was your prediction? Did you think the pencil was going to sink or float? Let's see if your prediction is right. The pencil floats. Do you see it kind of hanging out on the top of the water there? There it is, floating. Our pencil floats. Our first object that floats. So I'm going to put a check mark on floats for the pencil. There it is there. Float. And our pencil. Where am I? There I am. Alright, let's move on to the next object. Ping pong ball. Here's my ping pong ball. And we're going to test out if it sinks or floats. What was your prediction? Do you think the ping pong ball is going to sink or float? Let's find out. The ping pong ball floats. Here he is, just floating on top of the water. So go ahead and write that on your paper. The ping pong ball floats. Was your prediction correct? Alright, let's move to the next object. The next object is a rock. I found my rock outside in my backyard. So, what do you think? Is the rock going to sink or float? What's your prediction? Let's see if you're right. Ooh, it sunk, and it sunk pretty quickly too. Did you hear the bang when it hit the bottom of the container? The rock sank. All right, let's move on to the next object. The spoon. So here's my metal spoon here. So if you do this experiment at home, you might get a different result if you have a different type of spoon. I'm using a metal spoon today. But see, maybe if you use a plastic spoon, you might get a different result. Or if you use a spoon that is smaller, who knows? So here we go. Here's my metal spoon, and we're going to test out if it sinks or floats. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's going to sink, or do you think it's going to float? Let's see if you're right. Here we go. Oh, there it is, hanging out on the bottom. The spoon sinks. And you can see here my pencil is still floating on top, and still is my ping pong ball is still floating on top too. So the spoon sinks. All right, let's see. Our last object is our feather. This was the hardest thing for me to find. Here's my feather. I ended up finding it I pulled it out of one of my pillows I have at home that has feathers in it. But I'm sure if you look around in your backyard, you could find a feather. So here's my feather, and we're going to test out if this feather sinks or floats. Here we go. What do you think is going to happen? Is it going to sink or is it going to float? Let's see if you're right. Oh my goodness, the feather floats. And then we're going to do my two objects that I found around my house. And remember, you can choose any two objects that are okay if they get wet. You want to make sure you only choose objects that are okay if they get wet. My random objects that I chose that are not on this list, they're just two extra objects, are a crayon. I wanted to see if a crayon floated like the pencil or if it's different, and a rubber band. So those were my two objects. So let's see. Our crayon. Does it sink or does it float? Do you think it's going to float like the pencil, or do you think it's going to do something different? It's kind of the same shape as a pencil, and we use them both to write. So what do you think? Do you think it's going to float like the pencil, the crayon, or is it going to sink? Let's see if you're right. It sunk to the bottom. There it is, all the way down at the bottom. It sunk. I know it's hard to kind of see there, but there it is, down by the spoon. And you can see the pencil is still floating on top. And the last object, my rubber band. Do you think the rubber band is going to sink or float? Let's see if you're right. The rubber band sinks. It's sitting down at the bottom there. Wow, very cool. We have all of these different objects in our bucket of water now, and my container is empty. So we used all of the objects I collected to experiment and test out if they were going to sink or float. So boys and girls, if you would like to complete this experiment at home, all you need is a bucket, some water, and a couple of different objects to test out if they sink or float. All right, and that is the end of our science experiment. I hope you had fun today testing out our different objects, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye!